As Amanda said, my name is Genevieve Frazier, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm with the Behavioral Health and Wellness Center with HealthONE. We do serve all of Colorado, and we work with kiddos 11 to 17 as well as adults. We do provide intensive outpatient programming and a variety of other behavioral health services. And we do have 4 locations. So we're located in Aurora, Centennial, Littleton, and now down on the Rose Medical Center campus in Denver. And so we will be sending out a little bit more information about our summer programs and how to access our services. I do want to say that we're available 24/7, and you can call at any time to talk about our services for you or your loved ones. And so we're here as a resource, and thank you so much. And we'll be sending out more information after the program.
Thanks, Genevieve. So today's workshop, Depression and Anxiety 101, How to Recognize and How to Help, is being put on by Heather Badini, who is here with us today. She's a licensed professional counselor, licensed addiction counselor, and approved clinical supervisor with a passion for behavioral health advocacy, crisis management, resource connection, and educating community and professionals in care. She's been doing this work for over 20 years. Through direct care, training, teaching, and leadership roles, working in outpatient settings, intensive in-home settings, crisis settings, and inpatient care settings. Currently, she is in partnership at a group private practice, which is B Counseling and Consulting, and does crisis assessments, clinical supervision, and trainings for HealthONE. She holds a Master's of Clinical Counseling degree from the University of Northern Colorado and a Bachelor of Science degree in Psychology from Oklahoma City University, and also received her Addictions Counselor 3 in 2007, now holding a license in addiction counseling. Heather also has her approved clinical supervisor certification to supervise licensure for professional counselors. So we are in the room with someone who has a total wealth of knowledge and expertise, and I'm super excited to hear from you today, Heather.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks for having me. I always am like, oh, I've got a lot in there, but it's been a wonderful kind of journey working in Colorado and in our community, supporting people. So I'm very excited to be here and talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is depression and anxiety, and us trying to be a little more proactive and preventative and identifying things quickly. But thank you. All right, do you want me to go? I can go ahead and put the PowerPoint up so we can get started. Okay. All right. Can you guys hear me? Okay. All right, I've got my mute off and making sure. So I'm going to go
Heather,
through.
Oh, there it goes. Perfect. I was going to say we saw the note screen, but we're good. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So I'll go through and I talk kind of fast, but I will try to slow down at the end, probably in the last like 20 minutes. They'll be open for questions as people have them. And so, you know, if you want to write those down, I will go over those at the end. All right. So really wanted to talk about behavioral health symptoms through the lifespan. I think that you know, how mental health and depression and anxiety presents in different ages can have a lot of similarities, and then there's also some differences. And with the group here, really knowing that some people have young children, some people have like middle school age, and then also older adults and how that all plays out. So we'll go through that whole lifespan and I'll break down like those key pieces. But really understanding that also not only age, but also gender looks different. So men and women and how they might present with depression looks different. There's a lot of research that shows that women actually have a higher rate of depression, but it's unclear if that's because women present as sad and depressed more often than men. And in men, a lot of times depression manifests best in like an irritability, anger, and more of that kind of volatile pieces is how they respond to the depression versus like, I feel really down. That is not across the board by any means, but I think that sometimes is why those differential in percentages, because actually, like in the work I've done, I've seen equal men and women struggling with depression and anxiety. I always like this question, nature versus nurture. Where does depression, anxiety come from? Yes, there's a lot of research that shows there's a predisposition. If there's a family history of depression, that we will sometimes, that can lead to people having a higher risk of it. But I also want to really emphasize that in and of itself is not a reason or how people will experience depression and anxiety. And one of the ones I put on here is like trauma. Recently in the last 2 years, going through COVID and how that has impacted our community, how that's impacted our world, that has really caused a lot of shift in thinking and trauma to our community. So we're seeing an increase in depression and anxiety across all age spans and all genders. And I think that is because trauma can trigger behavioral health symptoms. Traumatic events, things that we feel out of control with, all of that can be that. And then the stressors, which again, we saw a lot of that in the last 2 years. So yes, heredity is a piece, but it is by no means the only piece. One of the other things this is my favorite saying, and I think it's really important for us to kind of get in the community when you're talking to people. I always say, it's okay to not be okay. I think that a lot of times we are taught to put on a brave face, put on a happy face, and you guys will see that kind of in the next slide of like, where people don't feel comfortable sharing like the pain that they're sitting in and how much and how disruptive that is to their life. And so when I'm working with families and when I'm working with individuals that are struggling with behavioral health, many times it's after a crisis event. Sometimes it's before that, but really getting comfortable with the language of like all of your loved ones, all of your connections and your support systems to be like, it's okay to not be okay. Saying like everything's going great and I'm doing great and Bobby Joe is over here doing great and everything's good actually doesn't address like if there are things going on. It doesn't open up that conversation to be like, you know what, things aren't 100%. We're working through this piece, and that transparency goes a long way. And it opens the door for people that are really struggling to be like, wow, I also am really struggling with that too. And then I think this is very much a thing, especially with depression. I always like to say it's not a choice. So one of the examples I always use with families, and I'll kind of go to this next slide because this really does I like this picture over here on the left one. It says, when you suffer from depression. I think that everybody in the world has experienced depressive-like symptoms, right? There are times in your life where you just don't feel as motivated and you're feeling like, I don't have the same kind of get up and go and do things that I want to do. And I think that when we see people and our loved ones struggling with depression, we kind of go there. And so we think, okay, they just need to like get up and go, and they'll feel better if they get up and go. Cause that's what I did. I felt better when I got up and went. But when somebody's really struggling with depression and they're in a depressive episode and it's a little more than that, oh, I've just got a lot going on, so I have a lack of motivation. It's really important to know that it's not a choice. They're not choosing to be depressed. They're not choosing to have this negative viewpoint on what's happening, the hopelessness, like they're miserable in it. And so I think that sadness piece is very different than depression. So really being able to differentiate that is really important. And when I show this picture to people in crisis and stuff, when they're trying to tell their family what they're feeling and how they're experiencing it, they really like this visual because it shows like, I really like a lot of me just feels nothing. And I don't know how to help my family understand what that looks like. And so then underneath that is that sadness, the self-loathing, anxiety, lots of guilt, isolation, and hopelessness. So just really understanding that's what some of the picture of what somebody's struggling like with depression. This other one, what I thought it would look like versus how it actually looks. I think that, I will work with families that they're like, they're doing so much better. They've been happy for the last 2 weeks. I think they're fixed. And I'm like, well, that's not how that works, right? Like, this is a process. This is a journey. They're going to have good moments. They're not always in a deep depression. That's not how it looks, but I think we think that, right? So that picture on the left where somebody's really in a dark room, isolated, like that's what we think depression might look like, but it very much can look like the guy on the left. I mean, we can look at celebrities that are comedians that are out in the public life that have struggled with depression, have had suicide, died by suicide and different pieces like that. And people just had no idea because they put on this face. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so this next part is, how do I know that it's more than just being, sad and that I'm struggling? I always like to say, like, that feeling of nothing. I don't get it with every single person I work with depression, but I would say it's probably about 90%. I just don't feel things. Sometimes they might not say nothing, but they'll say, I don't feel joy. I don't feel happiness. I don't feel the same emotions my family does. Like, I go to events and I just mirror what they're doing because I'm like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to feel. And so then so they're hard to capture because they're like showing that, oh, I can laugh and I can joke, and people miss the pain that they have inside. And again, that chronic, it's not always chronic. Only with like major depressive disorder where somebody's in a severe depressive dive will that be like more of a chronic thing that they see long term. Changes in weight, that can be major weight loss, that can be a major weight gain. I will work with people and they'll be like, well, I've lost like 60 pounds in the last 3 months. And I'm like, okay, were you on a diet losing 60 pounds, which is very dangerous, or like what was happening? And usually it is because of the hopelessness. And they're like, I just don't have the energy to eat. I don't care if I eat, those kind of pieces. So you're really looking at that appetite. Again, diminished interest in things. I don't want to go to the golf course. I don't want to go and play, at the pool. I don't want to go over to my friend's house. Those are those lack of interest of things of that the stuff that they usually would do. They jump right on. Those are things that you're looking for. Difficulty sleeping, like, oh, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night. I just have trouble falling asleep. Or they're sleeping too much. I see a lot of this. They're like, I can't get my teenager up. They're still in bed at 1 o'clock. And then when I do get them up, they're not really, they go and take a nap at 4. And so just sleeping a lot. Isolation. I think sometimes that's easier to find when you work with families that live together. They will notice that a little more. They'll be like, they're always kind of in the area that they can be alone by themselves longer, or they're deep into their phone and they're not engaging with anybody outside of that. They're not even engaging with other people on the phone. That's what I always ask. I'm like, okay, if they're gaming or they're on their telephone, are they talking to other people? Are they engaging with other people? And if they are, that's very social. If they're not and they're just doing stuff in isolation, that's what I'll look for. Suicidal thoughts, and we'll talk a little more about that because I have that in here. I rarely work with somebody that says I've never had suicidal thoughts. I've had several that'll say like I've never had them, but they're familiar with them and they know they've come close to having them. I think this is something that's really uncomfortable for families to talk about, for support systems to talk about, for people to say like, hey, are you having thoughts to hurt yourself? I've worked with people that have said, well, I don't want to put the idea in their head. And that's sometimes what we'll hear in the community. And I always say, if your child's 12 and over, they've heard suicidal thoughts. They know what that is. Kids in school are talking about it, social media, TV, like they're not unheard. You're not introducing a topic they haven't heard about. But I do think it's important to have better understanding of what they understand suicidal thoughts to be. I think there's a lot of times where it's an unknown and they're like, well, I have suicidal thoughts because I want to die. And I'm like, okay, so do you have a plan? What does that look like? And I think for families, just to be able to be like, do you ever have thoughts that you don't want to wake up? Do you ever thoughts that you wish that you were dead? Like, if you're not comfortable asking suicidal thoughts, you can ask those kind of things. Feeling hopeless. Sometimes they'll be like, I can't really see what's going to happen in the future. I don't think things are going to get better. Worthless. This is a core belief that I see a lot with people I work with. They're very hard on themselves. They're always feeling like they struggle in a lot of different areas, and they're like, I feel worthless. They aren't very good at finding that word. It takes them a really long time to find that that's what's underneath it, but that feeling of like not having a purpose, not knowing what to do with things. Again, recurrent thoughts of death, difficulty thinking or concentrating, like not remembering things like, oh, what were you saying again? I forgot. Oh, I wasn't listening. And like, there's nothing that's causing the distraction. Again, it's hard if you have somebody with ADHD, they do that naturally. But you're looking for ones that look like they're not like zoning off because of distraction. They're zoning off because they're just unable to concentrate or think or be present in the moment. Again, anger and irritability, we see this a lot in teenagers. We'll see it in kids. We'll see it in men, women, also occasionally. Just kind of depends on what's going on. But I think people miss that, like, oh, well, they're angry and they're always like controlling and doing these things, so they can't possibly be really depressed. And I'm like, there are actually some really good books on how anger and irritability is a starting point or really an extreme point of depression. Low energy, low self-esteem, laughing off difficult situations. I think this is hard. Sometimes people use this as a coping skill, which is good if they've been through a lot of trauma and that's how they cope. I think I always just kind of look a little deeper of like what's causing the laughter. If I am always like joking around and making fun of something that's hard, or like giving a hard time to friends on something that's really, shouldn't be something you're giving a hard time to people about. Those are the kind of things I look at, especially with teenagers. They are jokesters. They will use humor a lot. They will tease each other in impactful ways. And they'll be like, it's fine. Nobody cares. It's all good. And so digging a little deeper about like, but why are we doing this? And then imbalances in brain chemistry. I probably should have put this first, but definitely when people have depression, it impacts their brain chemistry. And so medications is absolutely something that can be helpful for both depression and anxiety. And I'll talk about that a little later on. So again, just breaking it down by age, depression in older adults. We see older adults that might have more social isolation. They've lost a significant loved one. They're just in kind of the aging process, like they're not working anymore. They're disengaged from their family. They're just feeling like, what am I here for at this point? So they may have more irritability. When you go over, they just be like, why are you finally coming over here? Like, what, leave me alone, those kind of things. If that's really out of character for them, I would look for that depressive piece. No, I'm just not in the mood to come over for dinner tonight. Thanks for inviting. And then they do that repetitively. And there's not really something else that they're doing. I would look for those kind of isolation pieces. Do you want to come over and watch the grandkids? No, I really don't feel like I'm up for that tonight. And you're getting that a lot. That's that withdrawal, loss of interest of things, especially if they used to come over, things like that. Personality change. As people age, like memory issues is a thing, whether they have dementia or not. Dementia is not a driving force of memory issues or personality change. But when it happens as a quick onset, that's where I'm looking at more depression than dementia. Dementia doesn't usually have like a super fast onset. And it's like, all of a sudden this person just changed in the last like month out of nowhere. Like they must have dementia. I'm like, well, let's just actually go back and see if we have somebody that's been struggling with depression. And now we're seeing these things come out with the irritability and the anger and the isolation and memory issues. Loss of appetite. I'll have a lot of older adults that I work with. They're just like, I don't really eat because like, what's the point? And so that's really what you're looking at. So if somebody's not eating a lot, I would ask a little more questions like, why aren't you eating? What's going on? And then fatigue, just excessive fatigue. For adults that are not older adults, there can be stressors, major life changes, traumatic events. So like divorces, change in jobs, moving, any of those kind of major life stressors that we look for, those are a time to kind of watch for depressive episodes, see how people are managing it. If they're having a lack of emotion, feeling disconnected. So that goes back to what I was saying, where they feel like they're just mirroring images, and you're not really feeling like they're genuine with their feelings when they're saying like, yeah, I'm super happy. And you're like, really? I don't feel like it, you're as happy until I'm happy, and then you're responding in kind. So watching for those things. You also might see an increase in substance use. It's a little more drinking, a little more pot smoking, other substances. I'm a co-occurring. I do addiction work for a reason, along with depression and anxiety, because they go hand in hand a lot of the time. Sometimes we'll see them like very sad, tearful, emotional. Then you also have the opposite end of that, anger, outbursts, irritabilities. It goes back to that worthless, hopeless, and recurring thoughts of death. So sometimes people will say, are you having suicidal thoughts? And they're like, no. And then I'm like, okay, but do you think about like not waking up and dying? And they'll be like, yeah, I do. And that just tells me where they're at in depression. And it can be helpful just having that conversation with somebody that you care about. Depression, again, for adolescents, there's a lot of research that shows too much screen time actually impacts the brain chemistry and causes an increase in depression with kids. And so that is very much a factor. So watching that as much as you can. I know it's hard because sometimes that's a very big part of their social group. And also substance use in adolescents. I've worked a lot in addiction and addiction work with adolescents, and sometimes people will be like, well, they're just here for substance abuse. I'm like, I have never met a 16-year-old that is really addicted to substances that doesn't have trauma, depression, anxiety, some other things going on. And so I really do look at substance use as having like some other factors that they're just not dealing with well. So then that, I will say probably my middle school kids that I meet with the most, that first one, the inability to feel joy and happiness is what I hear 95% of the time with that age group. And that's not like to the point that's suicidal, but like when they're starting to have these depressive episodes, they really are like, I don't really feel happy. When I'm alone, I get really like in a dark place. I don't even know what joy looks like. Those kind of things are stuff that they'll say. I just want to be happy and I don't know how. Increase in substance use, changes in sleep patterns. I absolutely look for that. Adolescents need more sleep. They need 10 hours of sleep for their brain and their body to develop well. So if I have a teenager that's sleeping 3 hours, I'm pretty concerned. They stop thinking, their frontal lobe's not fully developed to begin with. And then you put lack of sleep on that, and their reasoning and ability to problem solve and like make decisions and make safe decisions really goes downhill when sleep is impacted. Constant stress and dread. I don't want to do this. I don't want to go to school today. I hate school. It's a really like, please don't make me go. I don't want to leave the house. It's just going to be more than I can handle. Those kind of statements. I'm looking a little more into like what's going on and what's behind that. Again, suicidal thoughts. Kids are talking about it. Kids know what suicide is. Don't be afraid to say the words, to ask the questions if you have concerns. Excessive crying, angry outbursts, highly self-critical. So I think sometimes people will think, oh, I hear this actually a lot. They're a really high achiever. They're doing really well. They're really well into their sports, so they don't have depression. But a lot of times those high achieving kids, the kids that are like really focused at school, really focused on get like work or whatever their priority is. Sometimes that is a highly like in their head, they're telling themselves they're not worth it. They have to work harder. They're never good enough. And those kind of like negative self-talk really kind of brings it down. In the world, we've seen a higher increase of higher achieving students that are like in athletic programs in colleges that are suffering with depression silently, and then surprising everybody with suicide attempts and death by suicide. And so really understanding that just because things look really good and they're checking all the right boxes, that we need to also be asking other questions about how they're managing that. Children, we've seen since COVID, I'm hoping it's leveling out a little bit. There was a major increase in 10 to 12-year-olds struggling with depression and anxiety. We saw a huge influx of crisis work, I want to say, in the last like 18 months with that age group, more than we'd ever seen before. And I think that isolation had a big thing to do with it. Going back to school, going back to anxiety and stressors with that was really, really hard. So in children and that like middle school, 11-year-old, 10-year-old age, I'm looking at, are they wanting to quit things that they're doing? Are they changing? Like all of a sudden they liked Legos and now they don't. Those kind of pieces. Isolation, thoughts of death, drawing pictures of like things that might show like death or more violent pieces, helplessness. I can't do anything right. There's no point in me doing that. I shouldn't even go and do this math class because I can't even I don't know what I'm doing. Changes in appetite, sleeping problems, and then again, irritability and anger. So you guys see like a lot of trends there, like a lot of things that are very similar. So when we're thinking about depression and somebody that we care about, like what does that mean I do? Like as a therapist, I can say these are the things I do, but as family, support systems, friends, like what is it that you can do? Being able to talk about what is wrong. So in that example I gave early in the presentation about when you go in and somebody is struggling with depression and we think, oh, let's just get them up and get them out and they'll feel better. One of the things is that when somebody's like laying there and they're isolating and they don't want to get out, going in and trying to pep talk them actually can increase like the isolation and depression, because that's not, their brain has already switched in the chemical balance. And so their thinking is, see, I can't do anything right. I just sit here and I know they're right and I should go walk, but here I am just horrible at everything I do and I can't do it. So you want to stop that kind of motivation piece. If the motivation, if you say, hey, do you want to go for a walk? And they're like, no, then I don't keep coming up with ideas for them to come out. Just sit down and say, hey, what's going on? What's wrong? Just sit, listen, talk. What are you thinking about? Just take that time. And it's hard. We're all running 100 miles an hour. You might have 2 or 3 jobs that you got to get to, and you don't have time to sit there and say like, what's going on? But just listening and taking that time can really impact, like, I feel like I'm worthless and I don't want to get up. And then it lets you know what's going on. Also, again, that few days of feeling well does not mean it's fixed. In fact, I say if somebody's been pretty depressed and I've been worried about them for a while, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, they're doing really well. I'm like, watch that, because sometimes that's a high risk time period. Because when they feel well, it's because they like feeling that way and they don't want it to stop. And so they'll do higher risk things. You might have a suicide attempt in that part or thinking about it. But also like, don't think, oh, they were good for 3 days, so I don't have to keep watching and asking them what's going on. They must feel better. Again, I will say that over and over. I'm like, do not be afraid to ask about thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts. If you're having concerns that you're watching for depression, do not be afraid to ask those questions. because they have been thoughts that they've had. And even if they are like, I would never do that, that's really good information for you as a support system to know. And then supporting them and getting professional help. There's lots of services out there. And I think at the end of this, I have some resources, and I don't know if we have a resource list that we can probably send out, Amanda, that you can send out to the group, but helping them get professional help. And I've got some easy go-tos at the end that I'll go over. And just letting them know you're here for them. Hey, I'm here for you. I know this is going to be, I always like to use the word, this is going to be a journey. I'm on this journey with you. And you know, you're going to have some good days and you're going to have some bad days, and we're just going to work through this. And this is what it's going to be. Ask them how you can help. Don't focus on that advice. Don't try to fix it. Every person I work with, depression is like, everybody wants to fix my depression, and that's not how it works. And they're right. It's not. It's a process that they have to go through. They have to learn how to get that chemical balance to change for them in their brain and how they see things. And they have to do lots of strategies to help with that. And so just being there with them and helping to support them and getting that help is huge. All right, so that is all the pieces on the depression. I am going to kind of move to anxiety next. And so this is kind of the same piece of like, how do I know it's not just stress and that it's actually like anxiety that I need to be concerned about? Persistent worry and fear, like daily, like, oh, I'm worried about this. Oh, I don't know if I should do this. They have difficulty making basic decisions. What should we do for dinner? What should we do for lunch? Where do you want to, do you want to make chicken or do you want to make hamburger helper? Like, what is it that you want to make? And they're like, I don't know. I just can't make that. I'm worried about A, B, and C, those kind of things. Intense anxiety and fear that can lead to panic attacks. When I have people that struggle with like a lot of stress and stuff, and they're like, I'm having chest pains, I'm having difficulty breathing, I have a hard time taking full breaths. Those are all things that like tell me that they've got possibly a lot of anxiety. I mean, I might rule out heart attack too, but make sure like are you having anxiety? Is it building up where you're feeling panicky? And then a panic attack is people do feel like they're dying. They feel like they can't take a breath. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't take a breath. So I always say one of the strategies for anxiety is teaching people breathing techniques. And the worst thing you can do when somebody's having a panic attack is say, breathe, right? Because that's already where they're struggling. They're freaking out because they can't take a deep breath. And so instead of being like, hey, just breathe, do your breathing exercises, you actually want to kind of mellow out with them, and you want to show them and model the breathing with them, and anybody can do this. And so it is important. I just sit next to that person and I'm going to do 3 to 5 breathing, depending on how bad the panic is. And so it's a quick in breath, like a 4, count to 4, you go, 4, and then you slowly exhale. So 4 in, 6 out is the process of like how to kind of calm. And I don't say breathe in 4, breathe out 6, like, right? I'm modeling it. I'm doing the counting in my head, sitting next to them, so that when they listen to you breathe like that, they will start to breathe with you. Help me breathe with me, and you can do that as a loved one. I've done it with friends. I've done it with lots of different people in my life, and it's not like a therapy technique. It's something you can do. And it also calms you when you're worried about somebody in the moment and you're starting a little bit panic, which is normal. That breathing that you're doing with them also stabilizes your central nervous system so that you can be more present. So you guys can do that anytime you're having stress and anxiety in life. Self-harm can also be a part of anxiety. It can be a part of depression. That is where people might be cutting. They might be burning and doing different things to cause harm. Hair pulling, eyebrow pulling, eyelash pulling, all of those are ways to kind of fill more attached to body, understanding pain, experiencing pain, feeling pain, helps people kind of get more centered, helps them be like, okay, I am present. So I always do look at that self-harm as like what's happening, that they might be going outside of their body and feeling like they're not connected. And so self-harm, anybody you love that is or care about or friends with that is self-harming, really encouraging them to get into treatment is important on that. Insomnia, lots of issues with sleep, staying asleep. So insomnia can be initial difficulty falling asleep, or they might fall asleep really quickly, but then they wake up and they can't go back to sleep. All of those are things that we would consider. Fatigue, tiredness, agitation. The thing that you notice here is that a lot of these are also mirroring some symptoms you see with depression. And that is very true. I will tell you, when people come in with depression, they also have several symptoms of anxiety. Sometimes the anxiety presents itself first, and excessive anxiety that's not treated for a long period of time can sometimes lead to depression. Also, depression can sometimes lead to anxiety, but I usually see it the other way. The anxiety starts, then the depression hits. Because of the constant worry, constant anxiety, things aren't going to get better. That kind of constant thing happening in their head makes you feel a little more depressed, a little more hopeless, a little more lack of seeing the future. So that's why I do like to put depression and anxiety together. And I think that's why as a society, we see that a lot, because they very much go hand in hand. Lack of concentration, physical ailments. So I actually see this a lot with like trauma, anxiety, all these aches and pains. My whole body just hurts. I sick a lot. People with anxiety gets like, oh, I got a cold. Oh, I got another cold. Oh, I got sick again. Those are things that I'm looking for. And then the chest pains, that goes back to, if you go to an ER with a chest pains, they'll check for the heart attack. Their very next thing is anxiety. They're looking to see, are you having a panic attack? Is there behavioral health stuff going on for you that you're struggling with? This one I broke out a little differently. I didn't have like older adults and adolescents and all of those pieces, because really for adults, regardless of age, it looks the same. It looks very similar for children, and same with adolescents. So when you look at the adults, it's really referencing adolescence through adulthood. Children is your young children up to like early middle school. And that's mainly where you see a differential in some of the symptom severity and what they're presenting with. And the reason is because children haven't found the right words. They haven't been able to learn how to describe like why I'm anxious, right? As an adult, I can be like, I'm worried about my child falling off of that hill and rolling down it, and then a car hitting them and like creating all that. So like you're very clear of where the anxiety is coming from with an adult. For a child, like they have that separation anxiety, they have different things like that. It's very hard for them to verbalize, I don't want my mom to go, I don't want her to leave. And so then it comes out in crying, and that anxiety piece of like not wanting to have the parental figure or the person that's the caretaker leaving, and crying because it's traumatic for them and they're having that anxiety. Adults with anxiety, also with adolescents with anxiety, we'll see a little more substance use. And we're seeing more substance use in adolescents in general, and I think it's increased even more so since COVID. I think we've always kind of seen an increase, but I'm really interested to see the statistics that'll come out with that post-COVID. Excessive fear and worry, panic attacks, and then the physical ailments. So those are really what you're looking at. But at least usually with anxiety, adults will be able to say, I'm really anxious, I'm really struggling. And so it's a little easier to identify than depression. Not very often do you get adults that come out, or adolescents, and say, I'm depressed. When you do, celebrate it. I'm like, oh my goodness, thank you. So I am so glad that you're saying you're not okay. That's like, we all struggle. Let's figure out how to do that. It's really, really hard to ask for help. And so I always try to really celebrate those successes. Like, it is so much easier to go through life and say everything's okay. It takes a lot of vulnerability, a lot of risk to say, I'm not okay. And I think the more we do this as a society, as general lay people, like I will say that sometimes, hey, I'm not okay today, right? Like, the more we say that, the more it becomes acceptable for others to be able to say, I'm not okay. And then we don't miss people that might be really struggling in silence. Um, Children, you'll see the frequent crying, tantrums, nightmares. A lot of kids will have, like, I can't sleep at night because I'm waking up all night with these strange nightmares. That's actually a sign of a lot of anxiety that they're struggling with. And I do think that is something that we miss as society, as parents, as caretakers, that sometimes tantrums is anxiety driven, sometimes the nightmares are anxiety driven. Instead, we think it's behavioral, it's choice, they're acting out. So I would always look and see, is there something that's really causing them to be upset and agitated that's triggering these pieces? Difficulty concentration, restlessness, inability to sit still. Again, sometimes with ADHD, it's hard to tell, but you're going to see a little more. And I'll tell you, kids that struggle with ADHD have a lot of anxiety also. Very rarely are they coming in and being like, I have ADHD and that's all I have. Struggling with ADHD and struggling with the expectations of how to sit still and do what you need to do and concentrate in the way that society expects people to concentrate leads to a lot of anxiety, leads to a lot of depression. And so we see that co-occurring in a lot of ways. So how to help somebody with anxiety? Don't assume, just ask, right? So like, I won't, like, don't just assume, oh, they're having anxiety. I know you're worried about this. Being able to say, hey, what's going on? What are you thinking right now? What's got you most upset right now? I'm here for you. I'm here to support you while you're going through this. I really cannot emphasize enough, like, do not fix it. Even as a therapist, I don't fix the problem, right? It's not how that works. But I know when you have somebody you care about in your life, you want it to be better so badly. You're like, because it's scary. It's scary when you have a loved one that's struggling with mental health, when they have depression, when they have anxiety. And so our go-to a lot of times when we're scared is to fix things. And so really important to understand that it is not our role to fix it, but to walk alongside them in that journey of depression and anxiety and getting them professional help with it, helping them talk through situations, helping them problem solve, pros and cons. Like, what do you think you should do with this, right? Like, I did pros and cons list way before I was a therapist to make tough decisions in life, right? So doing strategies like that to help them, like, or what's the worst that could happen, what's the best that can happen, and what's the in between, helping them kind of problem solve situations like that, especially with adolescents. Their frontal lobe is not fully developed, so their cognitive like their ability to connect point A to point B equals C, like they won't make those pieces. So you really want to teach them how to critically think, how to problem solve. If you're really worried about this, let's talk about what's upsetting you with that. Hugs. I love this. This is really, really important. Hugs in all places are good. I think that the research shows, and I did not write down the word, and I'm sometimes bad at that, but like 30 seconds of holding another human being has amazing impacts on our central nervous system in healthy ways. And they can immediately calm, as long as the person's welcoming the hug. Don't just hug people because you want to hug. Ask permission, even if it is a loved one. Can I hug you? Can I, be there for you? Ask for that permission piece. But knowing that that touch is impactful in what we need as a human species, and very important. Meditation, aromatherapy, those are all things that can help with anxiety. So like, I'll have a kid that's having trouble sleeping at night, and I'll be like, do you guys have some like oh gosh, I just lost the train of thought. But it's it's not humidifier, but it's the other misters that you can put like essential oils in. So like a lavender oil can help a child sleep better. Lavender lotion, like you can go to stores and sometimes I can get it for like $2, like a lavender lotion that I can rub on my child's back, and it helps them sleep, those kind of soothing techniques. Recognize and praise accomplishments. People with anxiety never see what they do well. They only see where they're making mistakes or where, they aren't as good at something. So like, for example, I might have a kid that goes to a soccer game and they come off the field and they're bummed, even though their teams won, right? And it's like, what's happening here that they're really bummed out? And they're like, I had a really bad play. And my next question is, well, how many good plays did you have? Right? How many, like, did you have, I saw 7 good plays, right? So that's awesome. You had 7 fantastic plays, right? Praise, recognize the accomplishments because they can't see them. They're looking at what's going wrong and trying to fix that. And then again, encourage to get professional help. For both depression and anxiety, the evidence-based practice is doing medication management with cognitive behavioral therapy. Both of those have shown to have drastic improvement in depression and anxiety. And so they can work with their physician on meds for depression. They can get a psychiatrist if they have the means to, but sometimes that's pretty hard to get in the community. And a lot of PCPs will prescribe antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. But I always say, like, don't just have the medications try to fix the problem. They really do need to learn the cognitive behavioral therapy techniques of like, how do I make pros and cons lists? How do I look at my negative like schemas, and schemas is like your thinking patterns, and how do I change that? And so that is really a longer term impact than just medication itself. All right, so we're going to go back to suicide risk factors and protective factors. I always like to include this in. It does not mean that people that are depressed have suicidal thoughts. It's very important to understand there are a lot of people that struggle with depression that are never suicidal. There's a lot of people that struggle with anxiety that are never suicidal. And so I think that that is really important to understand, but I always like to know who it is, right? If I have a loved one that I'm worried about depression, I want to know where they're at with that. So suicide risk factors, protective, I'm looking at that hopelessness. The more hopeless, the more concerned, the more social isolation. These are factors that we look at in the clinical field of like, how many of these boxes do they tick when they have depression, and how concerned do I need to be? Financial stressors are a major stress on anybody. You add in depression, it increases hopelessness, other pieces like that. Legal issues, people that are facing upcoming court dates, very high risk on suicide. I always say, if they've got substances, they have a legal case coming up, they've got financial problems. Like, I've got a pretty high risk case that's also struggling with depression, hopelessness, things aren't getting better. I'm really watching for those risk factors. If they have a terminal illness, serious illness, long-term illness, rheumatoid arthritis, like people get really depressed with those kind of longer term diagnoses. Job problems, job loss. Some people identify a lot with job. It goes back into that financial stress piece too. Relationship problems, loss. I especially see this with kids and adolescents. Breakups are a big deal. And I take them very seriously when an adolescent is broken up with someone. Where are you at? How are things going? Like, what are you thinking about? Even if I don't have depressive symptoms, if I've got substance use and I've got a breakup, I'm concerned about an adolescent. Previous suicide attempts is absolutely an indicator for a higher risk of actually dying by suicide. So sometimes I'll have families, they'll be like, well, now they know better. They had this attempt and they're not going to ever do that again. And I'm like, that's not necessarily the case. We want to continue watching that, supporting that. Coping skills, These are your protective factors on the right. So coping skills is how, like, the more coping skills the person has, if they can come in and list to me like 5 coping skills, I feel much better about their risk factors. Able to problem solve through things. So like if I'm asking questions like, okay, so tell me what you're going to do next steps with that, and they can think through that, I'm a little less concerned. Connections to the community. That's huge. Isolation is a big deal. Connection to your community, going to faith-based, having family, having support systems, having friends, having teachers, having people that they feel is a part of their life is really, really important, and that they feel connected to it, and that they don't feel like an outsider looking in. That's the other thing I ask. Supportive relationships. If I have somebody that has depression and is struggling with that, I just limit access to means. I tell every parent I know, I'm like, don't have Tylenol in the house. It's an adolescent, you don't need Tylenol. And make sure that your meds, if you have a bunch of meds sitting around the house, I just put them up, and I tell parents, put them in your closet. Kids have to walk through your room to access that, hopefully. And I just put them in places that they don't readily see. I don't have, guns that they have access to, all of those kind of pieces. And then the other protective factor is availability to physical and mental health services. So sometimes when you have a loved one that is like, I'm trying to get help and I can't get anyone to call me back, that's a concern, right? So, and that is happening in our community. We're having a shortage in the healthcare field, of people having availability and being able to contact people back. And that is a stress point. So that's another thing I encourage families to do, or friends or caretakers or whoever, as I'm like, if you want to help, like, help them find a therapist, help them find somebody, get them in and take somewhere, because that's really stressful right now. And so when you're struggling to add stress of trying to find and ask for help and get good help, that is a big barrier and something that makes them feel a little more hopeless in that. All right. The last part I want to go over some really important resources, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. There's a really great service called I Matter. It should be all over posters, all over your kids' schools. They probably even have it posted in the YMCA, all of those places. But I Matter is a free service for adolescents in the state of Colorado. And so they can go online and type in their information, and they can receive free therapy services. Also, it's important to know, if you have Medicaid, you also receive free therapy services in the community. If you have somebody that takes Medicaid, you don't have co-pays on that. It doesn't cost additional pieces. And so really about kind of reducing that barrier to care. Psychology Today is another place that you can look for therapists. You can look for psychiatrists in there. You just go in and you put in your zip code and you put the insurance that you are looking for. It does take lots and lots of phone calls on there before you hit someone, so be very patient with that. That's also why I put group practices on here. Here are just common group practices in our area that at least most of the time you can get someone to answer the phone. It's not like a private practice on Psychology Today. So if you get someone to answer, they'll at least give you a quick answer of like, yes, we have space. No, we don't. Inpatient hospitals, so HealthONE, Medical Center of Aurora, we have the partial hospital program, partial hospitalization. That's what PHP stands for. Sorry, I didn't spell them out. And IOP is intensive outpatient. Those are all group-based programs, and all inpatient hospitals have like a partial hospitalization or at least an intensive outpatient program. Those are usually can be a little faster to get into than trying to find an individual therapist. And when we go back and talk about protective factors with depression and anxiety, we're talking about like that connection with the community, sitting with someone and being present with them. There's so much evidence that shows that doing group work, even if somebody's like, I don't want to go to group, I don't like to be in group work actually is very effective in working with depression and anxiety, because for somebody that is sitting here thinking that they are all alone in the world and how much pain that they're in, sitting next to somebody else that experiences that too and listening to their story opens up oh, I'm not alone. I'm not isolated in this feeling. This person understands where I'm at. it goes a long way. So I always say, if you can't find, a therapist getting into group therapy, those have a little better opening and quicker openings, and that's what I would do. And then also inpatient, we have crisis walk-in centers all over the state that you can go into, and they're mostly tied to the community mental health centers, and they also are tied to most of the inpatient hospitals. So you can walk in and call and get a space. School-based services, I think, are very important too. In lots of your kids' schools, especially in Denver County, I know there's several like, what happened? Okay. All right, let me see. Go back to my PowerPoint. All right. Can you see that or no?
No, we don't see anything.
All right, so I'm going to talk a minute while I get this up. So school-based programs. In the schools, a lot of the schools have free services, so people can get services while they're at school, which I think is huge to families. If families can't leave work to take their child to treatment, I do like the school-based program because they can see a therapist while they're in school. Of course, we're about to go into summer, so that has an impact, but it's definitely something that you want to contact your school about to see if they offer that. And then faith-based programs, if there's a lot of times churches offer free therapy. Not always, but some do, and it's always worth calling and asking to see if that is available. So that is the end. Any questions?
Thank you, Heather. I know we are over time, so I want to respect everyone's time. But if there are follow-up questions, I can always take them and forward them along to Heather or Genevieve. And you can always reach out to us for some additional resources as well. I'm just typing my email into the chat, making sure I spelled it right. But feel free to reach out if you do have further questions, and I'll be following up with some of the resources that you mentioned, Heather, along with any additional resources that came up as a result of the conversation.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thanks for presenting. It's great to have you both here. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. Take care.